In this video, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting what it's like to live in Atlanta, Georgia versus what it's like to live in New York City. And that's coming up right now. Hey everyone, welcome back to Living in Atlanta. This YouTube channel is designed to help folks who are considering moving here from out of state understand what it's like to live in the Atlanta area. My name is Marc Brenner. I'm a local realtor here in Atlanta. And if you're looking to purchase a home in the Atlanta area, I would love to hear from you. All of my contact information is in the description below. Please feel free to reach out anytime. I have folks relocating here and reaching out for help all the time, and I absolutely love it. So feel free to call me, email me, or even book a consultation directly using the link below. Okay, so I can't believe it actually took me this long to film this particular video. I've done a few city comparison videos before, but I haven't done New York, which is funny because I'm from New York originally. I grew up in a suburb about 30 miles from New York City, Rockland County. And so I have a unique perspective, I feel, as someone who grew up in and around New York City to someone who has now lived for over 10 years in Atlanta. So I'm hoping to be able to offer a unique perspective to you so you can understand what it's like to live in Atlanta, maybe from a New Yorker's perspective, because to be honest, you're probably not trying to decide between New York or Atlanta. You're probably in New York trying to decide if you want Atlanta to be your next city. So I hope this video provides that particular value for you. And to be honest, when I first moved to Atlanta from New York, I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I couldn't get the foods that I was used to. The people were really different. The weather was super different, and I just absolutely hated it. But now, after about 11 years here, I really love Atlanta. It grows on me more and more every year. So let's talk about some of those differences between these two great cities, and hopefully it can provide you some value in whatever your situation is. All right, so before we even get into it, we know that New York is especially unique. This is not an apples to apples discussion, right? There's no other city in the world like New York City. We know the expenses are crazy, the traffic, the amount of people. No other city is going to compare. So I am not really necessarily comparing Atlanta to New York statistically. I really am talking more about the vibe, what it's like to live and visit in Atlanta versus New York, and just some of the more subtle or lifestyle differences, if you will, between New York and Atlanta. And I'm also going to talk about expenses and cost of living and all that good stuff, but there's no other city like New York, so this is really just more of a personal experience having been in both areas. All right, first let's start with the broad strokes, the differences that you already know but may not know just how big the differences are. So let's talk a little bit about population and density, because that's going to give you a better idea of what your immediate environment is going to be like. So New York City population, 8 million people in the city, 20 million people in the overall New York metropolitan area. In Atlanta, it's about 510,000 in the city proper, and about 6 million people in the overall metro Atlanta area. So obviously there's many more people in New York, and it's very dense in New York, and that's probably one of the main differences you'll notice if you spend time in both cities. Atlanta is known for its sprawl, so we don't have anything like the density or walkability of a New York City. When you think of New York, you can walk down many blocks. You could really walk everywhere in New York, right? Well, in Atlanta, you pretty much need to own a car. Neighborhoods and highly walkable areas are not connected in a big way, at least not like they are in New York. So that is going to be a big difference, the overall density, crowdedness, and walkability of the cities. Now, in terms of geography, New York is obviously at the mouth of the Hudson River. You've got the ocean nearby, whereas Atlanta, you're landlocked, you're in the middle of the state, and so that's going to have some implications for weather and atmosphere and the food that you eat. So let's talk about weather real quick. So New York City obviously has 4 very distinct seasons, and it can get very cold and snow quite a bit in the wintertime, whereas Atlanta has much more of a mild climate, less distinct seasons. They sort of run on a little bit longer into one another. So longer, hotter, humider summers in Atlanta, much shorter, colder but wet, and really little to no snow in the Atlanta area. I will say, as someone who's grown up in the Northeast, the absolute best fall season is in the Northeast, whether it's New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, wherever. The foliage and the atmosphere, the colors cannot be beat. Although we do have a beautiful fall with plenty of wonderful leaves changing colors in Atlanta as well. But overall, weather, climate, New York City, very distinct, intense seasons, very easy to differentiate from one another. An intense, blisteringly cold, often heavy snow winter, and pretty standard other seasons. It gets very hot in New York City, but it doesn't have the humidity in Atlanta. So in Atlanta, you do still have 4 distinct seasons. Okay, it's not Florida, but you have a much shorter, less cold, less snowy winter. You have a longer, way more humid summer, and you have an absolutely beautiful fall and spring in the Atlanta area. All right, let's talk about nature since we were just talking about weather. How is the nature different in these 2 places? Well, both New York and Atlanta have some amazing nature to take part in. Both areas you can enjoy rivers, lakes, mountains, camping, hiking, beautiful forestry. You know, you can enjoy both of these things in both areas. Again, because of the weather, because of the climate, New York is going to be different in a lot of ways, but there's a very similar amount of variety between these 2 places. The only big difference that I would point out, and it's important to think about, is the accessibility of the nature, right? If you live in Manhattan, in New York City, you can go enjoy the nature, but it may be a bit more of a project for that day. It may take up the whole day to go enjoy a river or hike a mountain or whatever the case may be. Whereas in Atlanta, one of the amazing things about this city is that you're so close to great nature options, rivers, lakes, hiking, mountain climbing, camping, whatever it may be. You can certainly do those things. You know, if you live in Atlanta, if you live right in the city like I do, you're less than an hour from great hiking, rivers, and you're a very short distance from a lot of these things, and it's less of a project to access because you don't have the density, the population, the traffic, the tolls, the bridges, all those things that make it a little bit more of a hurdle for you to enjoy the nature. You have great nature in the city of New York, of course, as well, but I won't say one nature is better than another, but I do think Atlanta has more easy accessibility to some of those outdoorsy things to do, which may or may not be important to you. All right, so let's go right into things to do. What are the differences in the things to do in New York City and Atlanta? Well, it should be obvious to you. You have city amenities in both locations. anything that you typically want to do in a city across the US, you'll be able to do in one of these two cities, whether it's enjoy a fabulous restaurant, a great cocktail at a bar, go out clubbing, dancing, museums, whatever the case may be that you like to do in a city, you can do in both of these locations. Now, the truth is, again, you cannot compare with New York City. No other city in America, and maybe even the world, is going to have the history, the amount of museums, restaurants, historic landmarks, buildings, places to go. I mean, just geographically, the size of the city, everything is going to be kind of 10x'd in New York City. So there's everything you could possibly desire, and maybe some things that you don't want available in New York City. In Atlanta, those things are available to you as well. We've got great restaurants, we've got great bars, we've got great dancing, nightlife, things to do, clubs, all of that, whatever you associate with a city, museums, zoos, aquariums, sports. We have every, kind of sport that you would want to enjoy. So, the big difference is just going to be New York City is available on a grander scale. And again, in terms of things to do, this is kind of reiterating my point from a minute ago about nature. I think you have a little bit more variety in Atlanta, right? So, I can enjoy something in the city if I want to stay in the city for the day, but I can also do a day trip up to a vineyard that's only maybe an hour and a half away in the North Georgia mountains. I can spend a day out in the country enjoying wine from vineyards and then drive back and be home in time for dinner. I don't know that you can do that in New York City, again, because of the traffic, the density, the tolls, the bridges, the tunnels. It's obviously much more difficult to get in and out of New York City than it is Atlanta. It's very easy to get in and out of Atlanta, assuming you're not in a huge traffic jam. So what I would say is, you're never going to run out of things to do in New York City, but in Atlanta's defense, I think you can possibly get some more variety because it's a smaller city, there's less people, and there's less obstacles to getting out and exploring other corners of the state. All right, let's talk about job opportunities, because if you are trying to decide between these two cities, or if you're in one city and wondering what the other has to offer career-wise, this will be really important to you. Now again, New York, 10x, every job industry is going to have some level of opportunity. And I will say, though, that COVID-19 hit New York job and economy, I think, a little harder than it did in Atlanta for a lot of different reasons. So where it stands right now, I think you very well may have a slightly more difficult time, depending on what your job is, finding a start or continuation in New York City. Now, obviously, New York is known for some pillars, the finance industry and the banking industry, working on Wall Street, or film, TV, and theater, Broadway, off-Broadway. There are some unique opportunities in New York that you will not find in any other city in the world, and this is very similar to the video I did comparing Los Angeles to Atlanta. Career-wise, some of you, there will be no substitute for an LA or a New York, because your career path, there's one place you have to be. But if you don't fall into that category, Atlanta has an incredibly compelling economy and opportunity to start or continue your career. In fact, we have over 30 Fortune 1000 companies headquartered in Atlanta, and 16 of those are Fortune 500 companies. So there are some major companies headquartered in Atlanta. Think about Coca-Cola, Delta, UPS, Chick-fil-A, Porsche. The list really does go on and on. And so not only that, the diversity of the job industry in Atlanta is really something to keep in mind. We are not propped up on one industry, and I'm not saying New York is either, but Atlanta is uniquely diverse. We have shipping, we have tech, we have, film, TV production, we have finance and banking. We have a lot of different industries that are supporting a diverse and honestly a very strong economy at this point. Atlanta was recently ranked one of the best places in the country to start or continue your career. So, without knowing what your specific job or career path is, it's hard to say which is going to be better. But knowing what I know about these two cities, unless you have a very specific career that you're pursuing that you have to be in New York City for, again, I have to give the edge to Atlanta in this category. Now, something to keep in mind is your pay is typically going to be lower in Atlanta, right? The cost of living is lower, and unfortunately also your pay is lower. So if you are coming from New York in the same industry, make sure you understand what your position is being paid in Atlanta, because it may be surprisingly low. Now, you do have to take into account that a lot of your other expenses, housing, gas, taxes, normal expenses will be cheaper in Atlanta, so it'll offset that reduction in pay. But make sure you understand, if you are coming from New York, that your pay will not be the same. In fact, the average pay in New York is around $63,000 and the average pay in Atlanta is around $44,000. So quite a big difference, but obviously there's quite a big difference with the cost of living. And that's going to bring us right into the cost of housing, which is going to be one of the biggest differences between these two cities. Obviously, New York is notorious for having some of the most expensive real estate in the entire country, in the entire world, actually. So the average cost of a home in the New York area is about $800,000, and the average cost of a home in the Atlanta area is going to be about $300,000. So your dollar is going to go a lot farther when it comes to housing in the Atlanta area. In fact, hopefully you've seen some of my videos before, but you should know by now that you can live in some of the best suburbs in all of Atlanta at a budget of, maybe around $350,000. And that's the best suburbs, $350,000 to $400,000, Alpharetta, Sandy Springs, Milton Johns Creek. It does get more expensive, but you can get a move-in ready home in some of those areas around that price range. Where in New York, that wouldn't get you even a fraction of what it would in Atlanta. So you're definitely going to make some sacrifices on the housing side if you live in New York. And honestly, for a lot of people, it's going to mean you have to rent in New York. So if homeownership is something that's important and a big goal of yours, it's definitely going to be easier to do in the Atlanta area. And that'll take us right into rent, because I know a lot of you aren't interested in buying, or you're just not in that place in your life. So average New York City rent, $3,000. Average Atlanta rent is around $1,500. And honestly, you can rent a one bedroom in Atlanta for much cheaper than that. But those are the averages. So overall cost of housing, this is probably one of the biggest differences between these two cities in the entire video, is going to be what it costs you to either buy a home or rent a space to live in. All right, so let's move right along to the difference in taxes, income tax, property tax, so on and so forth. So your income tax in New York City is going to be between 4 and 8%, depending on your income, and your income tax in Atlanta is going to be around 5.75% for the majority of Atlantans. So slightly higher income tax on average in New York City. And your property taxes is actually a lower percentage in New York City, believe it or not. But because of the higher dollar values of the homes in New York City, you're going to probably be paying more in yearly property taxes in New York. Now, for reference, in Atlanta, I own a home that's worth around $365,000, and my property taxes are around $2,000 a year. So that's very cheap for a lot of people coming from more expensive cities, but maybe that's more expensive if you're coming from a very rural area. All right, so public transportation, this is a category that Atlanta really cannot compete. New York City is known for its vast historic transit system, the subway system in New York City. You can call it dirty, unreliable, crowded, whatever. It's very easy to understand, and you can get around in New York City without a car. In fact, a large percentage of people who live in New York City do not own a car. Now, that's only possible because an incredible public transit system, whether it's the heavy rail, the buses, and then of course a lot of people bike in New York City. But Atlanta, we have MARTA. It's very limited. There's pretty robust bus system in place, but in terms of the heavy rail, I've talked about this before, very limited. A simple T shape in the heart of the city. If you're not on that north, south, or east-west line, you're going to have to drive to the station to hop on the heavy rail. So it's very limited, and honestly, you do need to own a car to live in Atlanta, whereas that is not the case in New York City. So this is definitely a leg up for New York. All right, let's talk about crime. What is the difference in crime between these two cities? And if you haven't checked out my recent video in Atlanta about the most dangerous neighborhoods, that will give you a really good handle on what the crime is like in Atlanta. But in terms of the differences between these two cities, again, it's really hard to compare. New York with millions and millions more people. Now, statistically, and I talk about crime statistics in that video for Atlanta that I made, New York is a very safe city with the ratio of people to incidences. New York is known for its safety, right? It was very dangerous and dirty back in the 70s, and it's changed a lot, and some people would say, not for good reasons, but statistically, New York City is a very safe city. And statistically, Atlanta is a more dangerous, crime-ridden city. Now, I don't think statistics paint the whole story for crime in a city. I think you really do need to understand the neighborhoods, the street, the neighbors, how the houses are maintained, what the foot traffic is like, who are the people in these areas. So there are a lot of factors in determining your personal safety in a city. I would not avoid either city due to crime concerns. Any city that you live in, if you're going to live in a big city, a major city, you have to be aware of your surroundings. You have to not leave valuable items in your car, and you have to be smart about being alone, especially at night. So although statistically New York is a safer city, I would not hold that against Atlanta, because it's not hard to feel safe in Atlanta. Now, anything can happen at any point, but if you know certain areas to avoid, you shouldn't typically run into a problem here. All right, let's talk about food. This is one of the biggest differences between these two cities, and this is one of my biggest pain points as a New Yorker moving to Atlanta. The food I can't get down here in the South. I can get some food down here that I can't get in New York, but just as a New Yorker moving to Atlanta, if that's you, you're gonna have a tough time with things like bagels and lox, great Italian delis where you can get a great Italian sandwich, sub, hoagie, breakfast sandwiches, bacon, egg, and cheese, ham, egg, and cheese, sausage, egg, and cheese, salt, pepper, ketchup. Not so much in Atlanta, unfortunately. These things are foreign. They have not been introduced into this population. Now, some people down here will tell you can get great bagels. I have my own opinions on that, but those are some of the big food differences. I will say there's some good pizza down in Atlanta. Not in the same volume and variety as New York, but you can get good pizza down here. But the big ones, probably the thing that I miss the most is the deli, the Italian deli, or the Jewish deli, or the bodega. Just kind of your one-stop shop for, a great sandwich, basically, great bread. That does not exist in Atlanta. It really does not, unfortunately. So, and there's some broad differences, like there's going to be more great Italian food and seafood in New York, right? You're closer to the water. You got big populations of Italian people. So you're going to get a lot of those mom and pop type restaurants, the delis that I was talking about. Not so much down here in the South, obviously more geared towards barbecue, Southern cooking, soul food, fried food, which don't get me wrong is fantastic. It's not my particular favorite food, but I do enjoy it. You're not going to see really great seafood down here. You're not going to get great bread, great sandwiches, great bagels. You're not going to get great diners like we like in the Northeast, where you have a menu that's 25 pages. You don't have that down here. You have Waffle House down here. We love Waffle House down here. I personally will take a great diner any day of the week, but you do learn to have a sense of pride about Waffle House living in Atlanta. I don't really know why, but we're proud of it. So those are some of the biggest food differences. In terms of that fine dining, again, you can't compete with New York, but you can get fine dining in Atlanta. You can totally have a Michelin type experience in Atlanta. You just won't have the variety and amount of options as you would in New York City. All right, so I went through a lot of statistics, a lot of the big differences between these two cities. Let's get into more of the vibe and the culture, and what are the big differences I noticed having grown up in New York and now lived in Atlanta for many years. Well, the people are very different, not in a bad way, just, the people are very different in these two locations. Northeastern folk versus Southern folk. Now, one thing I will say is people are slow down here. And no disrespect, I mean it out of love, but not that I'm better than anyone, but when you grow up in the Northeast, it's kind of ingrained in you to get where you're going as fast as possible, to move quickly, not only for yourself, but out of consideration for others. And for whatever reason, people down south do not have the same sense of urgency, or really any sense of urgency. People move on their own time. They're not in a hurry. They're not in a rush to get out of your way. So when you're standing in line, or you're in traffic, or wherever you are in the South, people will take their time. And this was personally a bit of a struggle for me to adapt to. I'm over it now, but it is a big cultural difference that you should be aware of. People in New York, they are known for two things: moving quickly and minding their business. And that's not the same way it is here in Atlanta. People don't mind their business as much, and they don't move quickly. So one is not better than the other. This is just simply a difference that I have had to get used to, slow down a little bit, and be more interested in what other people are doing, I guess. But, a lot of people down south perceive New Yorkers as rude. I've never thought New Yorkers are rude. I've always thought they're direct to the point, and they have things to do and places to be. And, one of the differences I would say is, because everyone says everyone down south is so nice. People down south are nice, but also, when you kind of get under that exterior, it could be a bit of a different story. So the way I like to compare it is that, folks in New York have a little bit tougher an exterior, but also when you break through that, they do anything for you. They really will go the extra mile in taking care of you, whatever that means. Whereas I think people down south is kind of the opposite. It's a little bit more of a friendly exterior, a friendly veneer, if you will. But you might find out someone's saying something about you that you would never have suspected. So a little bit of a switch up there. Again, not to say one people are better than another. These are just cultural differences that I've personally noticed. Now, some of the other random ones are things like college football is huge in the Southeast and in Atlanta, whereas where I grew up in New York, no one cares about college football. For whatever reason, we don't grow up really rooting for college sports teams, whether it's football especially. But honestly, I think where I grew up, lacrosse was more popular than college football, whereas down here, it's an entire way of life. So that's a cultural difference. Guns. I didn't know anyone who owned a gun in New York when I grew up there. And now I know very few people down here who don't own guns. So the gun laws are way more lax in Georgia, as you would expect. And the gun culture is bigger down here. And people conceal carry. They go to the range all the time. But guns are more prevalent and more important to folks down in Atlanta, as is religion. We are in the Bible Belt in Atlanta, and so you get more people who have church as something that's very important to them. You hear more discussions, you know more people in the church community. Now that, of course, exists in New York, and you have a wide range of faiths, but specifically the Bible Belt, the Christian church is more prevalent in the Atlanta area. I think people feel very comfortable talking about that, whereas in New York, not that you have to feel uncomfortable talking about it, but there is definitely a little bit less religious in the Northeast, and the whole topic, I think, is respected a little less. Maybe I'm reading into that too much, but that's another big cultural difference. Now, the last big cultural difference I'll mention is diversity, cultural diversity. And there is a lot of diversity in both locations, but in a different way. New York City truly is a melting pot. You have a lot of different cultures very close by that intermingle every day, and that has an amazing effect on the culture, the vibe, the restaurants, everything that makes a city a city. Now, you do have that in New York. You've got Italian people, Puerto Rican people, Dominican people, Black people, Jewish people, all in a melting pot together and intermingling quite a bit, although of course they do also stay within their own to some degree. Whereas I find in Atlanta, you have white people, Black people, Spanish people, there's big Mexican populations and Asian populations, Korean and Vietnamese. So you do have, it's not like everyone in Atlanta and Georgia is white. You do have diverse groups of people, but I find they're a little bit more segregated down here. And again, that might be anecdotal and just what my experience is, but it does seem to some degree like people down south stick with their group a little bit more than in New York, where New York is just everyone's smashed together, in each other's space, in each other's neighborhood. And I think a lot of beautiful things come out of that, a lot of diversity and acceptance and unique qualities. Whereas my time in Atlanta it's been a little harder to tap into some of those communities that I'm not naturally a part of, and whether it's in the church scene or just, the social scene, the career scene, unfortunately is a little bit more segregated. It's not, it's such a natural kind of segregation. And it's not to say that, different people groups, different races don't hang out. I'm not saying that at all. There's very accepting in Atlanta as well. It's just a little less of a melting pot in Atlanta is what I'm trying to say. So that is a unique cultural difference between the two cities that you should be aware of. So overall, we talked about a lot of statistics. We talked about housing, crime, weather, taxes, pay, jobs, all that stuff. I'll just give you a quick anecdotal rundown. So moving down here to Atlanta as a New Yorker was super difficult for me because I didn't have a lot of the comfort foods and comfort amenities that I grew up with in New York City, like the great delis, the great bagels. So that was a challenge. The weather was a huge challenge. The allergies from pollen, the humidity and sweating in the summertime with the crazy heat was super challenging for me. And it was challenging to adjust to the people who don't necessarily move with a sense of purpose. They're just kind of mosey along. That was my issue to work out. So once I sort of got over those things and started looking at the positives in Atlanta, all the sunshine, the great mild climate, the affordable housing, the incredible job opportunities, the beautiful nature all around me, Atlanta has grown on me year after year, and I can safely say I absolutely love living here. It grows on me every year. So, if you're trying to decide between these two cities, what I would say is, unless there's something that New York can offer that, no other city can, which is the case sometimes, I think Atlanta's just got more opportunity, better cost of living, better housing opportunities and better career opportunities. So that's if you're choosing between the two cities. If you're moving here to Atlanta from New York, you're gonna love it. It may take a little while to grow on you, but you're going to absolutely love it. There's gonna be a lot of things that you enjoy about living in Atlanta. So be encouraged if that's you. And yeah, guys, that is the big differences between New York City and Atlanta, coming from someone who grew up in New York and has now been in Atlanta for about 11 years. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I really hope it provided you some value. It would mean so much if you just liked this video and hit subscribe. It's a big free way to support me and my channel. And if you do want to connect, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's what I want you to do. So I hope you enjoyed that video. My name is Marc Brenner. This is Living in Atlanta, and I'll see you next time.